Hello guys, Tops here. Today I have something very special for you, and it is a weapons tier list. I wanted to do this for a long time now, and these are the weapons in the game. And I wanted to clarify a couple of things. I will only go over the most common ones. I think this is most of them, but I don't think it's all of them. So there's maybe a weapon missing. And I will not go over famed weapons. So basically if you find a famed weapon, most of the time it is worth building a bro for this famed weapon. If it's a good famed weapon. So if it's a weapon that high rolled on max damage or something, then it's worth building a good bro around this weapon. Generally, there are 3 tiers of weapons. So there are tier 1 weapons like a knife. The tier 2 weapon would have been the Dagger, and the tier 3 variant would have been the Rondel Dagger or the Katal Dagger. And generally, tier 1 weapons are the weak weapons that are very common early game. Tier 2 weapons are the stronger weapons that are more common mid game. Tier 3 weapons are the strong weapons that you kind of have late game, or that you used to find later that are very expensive. And generally, tier 3 weapons are stronger than tier 2s, and tier 2s are stronger than tier 1s. This should be obviously clear. So, I wanted to categorize the weapons in 5 weapons. The last one is it's better than fists, which will apply to a lot of early game weapons. It is just, especially early game. If you have bros that don't have weapons, you just give them anything that you have. So these are kind of the weapons you would never use if you have any other option. This is where this tier belongs. Then I have something for special weapons, for special builds. So something like a banner, for instance, would be in here. You want to build a bannerman every game, but the bannerman is not a generic, very good weapon for a specific build. Then I have weapons that are good weapons for the early game builds, for the mid game builds, and very strong weapons for the late game builds. And yeah, let's get right into this. I think we will start with the 3-headed flail. And already think the 3-headed flail is technically a tier 3 weapon, but I would categorize it into good weapons for early game builds. Because this weapon hits, we can show in the wiki, is one-handed flail. Right, and the problem with this weapon is it has very high base damage, but it strikes for 3 times with less damage. It's 1/3 of the damage. So actually you do very little damage against armored opponents, but you do insane damage against unarmored opponents. And this is very strong if you basically build a guy who goes on the heads. So this is very strong for farming early gear from brigands, from thugs and raiders. So if you can find one of these weapons, nomads carry them early, it is very good to farm armor and items and gear and stuff. It is also pretty good damage, which has a high fatigue cost, but pretty good damage against unarmored heads opponents, good against something like Orc Youngs or Orc Berserkers who don't have high head armor. It's good for the early game, but because of the technicalities of the 3 strikes, it's pretty bad against high armored opponents, which will be very common late game. And it also is not that good with fearsome, right? Because only the first proc applies fearsome, the second procs only can apply fearsome the normal way. So the bonus is only for the first strikes. And this weapon, if you fight armored opponents, basically does no damage. It is really hard to actually damage an opponent that has armor. So, still good for early game farming. And I think, I must say, the normal flail is in the same category. It is very good for early game farming. And where is the other flail as well? Same with the wooden flail. I would say the wooden flail is better than the fist, but like the super couple first days weapons. And where's the reinforced wooden flail? The normal reinforced wooden flail. I can't find it, guys. Maybe it's not on this list, but there's a reinforced wooden flail that basically does the same thing, just a little bit more damage, a little bit more durable. It appears to not be on this list. Anyways, yeah, I would say flails are very good for early gear farming with headshot, because there's a ability, it is called slash. It has 100% chance to hit the head if the attack hits. Okay, so there's an ancient pike, and the ancient pike is something that you get from ancient undead, and I would say it's good for the for the mid game polearm builds. It is really high damage early game, and it's also really reliable damage because the polearms, they get pluses to hit. This is, I think, 50 to 80 damage or something like that, and plus 10% hit chance with additional headshot chance. So this is really good for the mid-game polearm builds, and is most of the time your most reliable DPS because your frontliners don't have enough defense to carry big two-handed weapons around. So a lot of your frontliners will have spears and swords, and your backliners will have polearm in the earlier mid-game. I would say good for the mid-game. Then we have the broken short sword from Ancient Legendaries. I would say it's better than fists. Very early game weapon. Nothing too special about it. Then we have the Ancient Spear. This is basically the weaker version of the Ancient Pike. I'd say it's good for early game, and you have nothing else. Then we have the Ancient Spear. It's very good for early game builds, for something like a dedicated spear guy who just takes spear mastery and does a spear wall for lower fatigue cost. Really good against early brigand fights, early thug fights, early beast fights. Like spear and swords, they solve all your early game problems. So the ancient sword, the scythe, the arming sword, all of the spears and swords are really good for early game. So I will take also the boar spear, obviously. There's the reinforced wooden flail, by the way. It's also very good for the early game for armor hunting. Here, the goblin sword, really good for early game. So I will put all of the spears and swords in the good early game tier list. And the spears, you might use them on tanks later even on for the additional hit chance. But yeah, again, this is what I would suggest. And I will put all the spears, all the swords on this list. Because the swords have plus 10% hit chance, the spears have plus 20% hit chance. And this is early game. When your bros have really low melee attack, they will all use swords and spears early game. So highly recommend this for good weapons for the early game bros. Most of you guys will already know that. If you have problem hitting stuff, take a spear, take a sword. Your bro will actually start hitting stuff. All right, then let's continue. These barbarian weapons, the barbarian cleaver, these weapons I don't like. They have very low damage and are just generally not really worth using, except if you have no other weapon, because a sword, a spear, a flail will do more for you most of the time. Will do more damage, has more utility. This one can be nice for stunning if you don't have the bludgeon. And there we already talk about the bludgeon. The bludgeon is the tier 1 mace. And this one is really good for stunning an opponent. And stun makes an opponent not being able to act. So this is really powerful early on to have somebody who can just stun. And you can stun dangerous opponents and basically take them out of the fight, and then your bros can do damage against this guy. Really powerful early on, highly recommended for the early game builds and early game bros. can make your fights easier. So then we have the whip. I would say the whip is a special build because the whip kind of needs cleaver mastery in order to work. You can disarm your opponent and you can stack bleeding on opponents. It's really strong with mastery and is most of the time something for a quick hand banner, and you just take whip mastery on a bannerman to just casually disarm people. It's the only weapon that can hit from 3 tiles away, so a very special weapon, good utility early on. Same like this is the barbarian whip, this is the normal whip. Is pretty good early on to disarm fallen heroes, orc berserkers, orc warlords, something like this. But it's not really strong later on. It's very special. It's not needed, but certainly something good to build for. All right, and next special weapon is the fencing sword. As you guys probably know, it is the sword of the fencer, and the fencer is a special build because this sword has a special ability, which is lunge. And lunge means you can move 2 tiles and basically jump an opponent and do damage based on your initiative. And you ignore zone of control. So this is very nice if you have somebody who has high initiative, very nice on the fencer build. But generally, the weapon does lower damage than the arming sword or the high noble sword. But it only does damage if you have a high initiative pro, if you use the lunge ability. The base damage of this weapon is actually, I think, lower than this one. So there's no other reason to casually use this. This is a very specific build that you might not want to build everyone, but can be funny. Okay, so yeah, let's continue. The Bardiche. The Bardiche, I would say the Bardiche is a very strong late game build because it is basically the two-handed axe, but it also has the straight AoE attack from the longsword. It's basically the stab attack. Let's see, where are the two-handed axes, right? It can split, which will hit 2 targets. So you have reliable AoE in the front line, but it can also do the high single target damage from the normal axe, where you just do split man and you do 50% bonus damage. Hits head and body for additional bonus damage. That's basically what you can do with it. So it has lower damage than this one, just barely, but it has the reliable AoE that makes this really good for late game frontline bros to have the reliable split man, but also the high single target damage. It's basically reliable AoE. Talking about the axes, I will obviously also put the big great axe and also the big chosen axe, the barbarian big rusty axe. Is basically the same weapon with less damage, higher armor pen. This is higher base damage. All of these weapons are really strong for late game builds. They work very well with the long axe, quick hands. So really, really strong in late game builds. It's good for Battleforge damage frontliners with axe mastery. You just kill everything with Killing Frenzy and Berserk. I really like these weapons. Good late game, and if you can get a hold, this is generally, if you get a hold of these weapons that are strong for late game builds early, you get ahead of the curve, because having access to these high damage weapons early, where you fight weaker opponents, means you can just shred weaker opponents with these stronger weapons. Because these weapons do way more damage than these weapons or these weapons. Or generally the lower tier weapons. So highly recommend, if you get your hands on them early, it's really strong. So the next one, let's grab a trash one, the pickaxe. This weapon does guaranteed, is a hammer, the tier 1 hammer. This guaranteed 10 hit points damage is kind of like the hammer axe from the barbarian. Very weak weapon, basically no damage. And this, yeah, I don't like this at all. It is just pitiful damage. And as soon as you have something useful, I would just throw this weapon away. Does basically nothing. The loot is kind of a fun weapon. It gets destroyed on use, so you can only use this once to bash something. You get an achievement if you stun somebody. But yeah, this is just a meme weapon because you can only use it once. All right, let's continue. I would say generally the orc weapons, the big orc flail and the orc one-handers, most of the time they have higher damage than the normal weapons, but they cost additional fatigue. So it's really not worth using this because of the fatigue costs. Same with the goblin weapons, they have very low damage. There are exceptions though, and that is the Mansplitter. I would say the Mansplitter is a very special build. No, is it a special build? I would say it's a mid-game build. I remind myself. This is a Mansplitter is a good mid-game build for a bro that has high melee attack, but no relevant other stats are really that good. You can just go Crippling Strikes, Executioner, X Mastery on this guy, make him nimble, so you have a lot of fatigue, and then you just go berserk with him. Because this weapon does a shit ton of damage, but the high fatigue cost means you can't swing it a lot. So use it carefully, but it's a good tempo build if used correctly. Well, this is the Shaman stick. It's a trash weapon. And what else? Yeah, the pitchforks, the early, you know, the spatums, the pitchforks, the early game blades. I should put them good for early game builds, but yeah, let's put them good for early game. These are kind of the early game polearms that you find that do okay damage, but are not really they are not really that great. Let's say it this way. You will swap to higher damage polearms as soon as you can. They're like these polearms. They're fine, but you know you want something higher. All right, this is the normal butcher knife. The one-handed cleavers, especially the tier 1 and tier 2s, are just, in my opinion, not really worth using it because they cost a lot of fatigue to use. The damage is not that high. It is most of the time better to just go for swords or spears or polearms. Maybe a flail to hunt some armor down. It's kind of what I would say. The stick is obviously, it's a tier 1 stun, but you rather have a bludgeon if you can. So for stunning people, for the stun build. This is also early game. This is the southern variant of the mace, the tier 1 mace. Nothing special there. Here we have the short sword and yeah, sorry guys, I'm a little bit all over the place. Now we come to the billhook. The billhook is the strongest normal polearm, if I'm not mistaken. I know it is, but let's actually see. The polearms. Where are the polearms? Here we go. Yeah. This one is the highest damage polearm. Highest max damage polearm, to be fair. And this one has also very high armor effectiveness, or bonus against armor, and additional headshot chance. So this is kind of the classic mid-game polearm build you want to make. This is kind of the weapon you want to go to. If you have a billhook, it's a really good mid-game weapon. If you can find a billhook early, it is really high damage early game. Falls off late, but I kind of like polearm, the crossbow polearm builds for the late game. Okay, so for the mid-game. And they, most of the time, are still usable even late game. The jagged pike is the goblin pike. The special thing about this pike is you can actually move 2 tiles and still attack, and it makes bleeding. So this is basically a polearm for people who don't have polearm mastery, because normally you need polearm mastery. The polearm mastery reduces the action points down to 5, so you can actually move 2 tiles and attack once still. This weapon does it basically without the polearm mastery. Okay, so let's continue with axes. Should we do one-handed axes? All right, let's do this. One-handed axes. I don't like these weapons. They have high damage, but also high fatigue cost. The problem with them is they offer no hit chance, no bonus hit chance, which you kind of want early game. Actually, you kind of need this early game. And they cost a lot of fatigue. So if you run out of fatigue fairly fast, and they only do damage. They are not like the Mace, who can also stun in addition. They just do damage. So I don't like this weapon class most of the time. Although they are one of the highest damage dualist weapons. So I will put the tier 3 version of the one-handed axe in the good mid-game builds. The one-handed axe dualist is actually a high damage mid-game build in combination with Headhunter, I must say. So if you have a bro that has fairly high fatigue and you want to make him a dualist, an axe dualist is a very good kind of mid-game tempo build which does a lot of damage. But the problem is all weapons can do damage, but most weapons have second abilities that also have utilities. And generally, for damage, you want the big two-handed axes, not the one-handed axes, because they cost less fatigue and do more damage. So this is, it's a special build, good for mid-game, an axe dualist headhunter guy. I would do the same with the barbarian one-handed cleavers. Generally, I don't like their one-handed cleavers and one-handed axes. I will just put them down here. Okay, let's see the knives. I would do the knives as special builds. The knives you can puncture down any opponent and with the second attack of the knife. So you will use the butter knife early on to farm armor. And there is later on, there are two builds. The Dagger dualist and the... Actually, I will take the Katal to very strong late game, because this is actually for the Mace Katal build and the Mace and the Katal dualist build. So this dagger with weapon mastery goes down to 3 action points, so you can attack 3 times per turn for 30 to 45 damage. So this weapon has almost the same damage as the broadsword, but attacks 3 times per turn, not 2 times per turn. So the damage on this is insane. Also with the Death Blow trait and the dualist perk, it's just the damage is nuts. Very strong late game. And for Dagger dualist and Katal, Mace Katal dualists, very strong. And these ones, they cost no weight, so every bro will have a knife or a dagger in his backpack to just pull out the knife and puncture an opponent in order to gain armor. This is like what I do. So every bro until late game will have one of these in your pockets, and they can be very good early game for a puncture, because puncture procs moral checks, very good weapons. The Rondel dagger is the stronger version. It's the tier 1, the tier 2, and the tier 3 weapon of this weapon class. Good weapons, but a little bit special. I put them special because they have a very special use case. All right. I say this one is the axe. This is the tier 1 two-handed axe. I find it hard to use, although it is really good damage. But it is hard to use early game because early game you want bonus hit chance from the spears or the maces, from the spear or the swords, or you want utility from the maces and the flails in order to get armor or something, or you want the polearms for additional hit chance and the ability to hit from 2 tiles away from your backline. So kind of like, don't like this one, but it's fairly high single target damage. You can make it work if you find them early. So this is, let's see, this is the pike, obviously polearm, good mid game damage. So let's continue. This is the cleaver from the undead. Don't like this weapon. Okay, this is the two-handed cleaver, and it is the let's say, okay, 200 cleaver is one of the highest DPS builds in the game. And this is the crypt cleaver from the ancient undeads. benefits. You can find this. Ancient Onagars have this. So you could find this early on. It is very high DPS. Same as the Southern Cleaver and the Barbarian Cleaver. They differ in base damage. This has the highest base damage. This has more armor pen, and this is more armor effectiveness. I like all three cleavers. They're very strong weapons for late game builds. And I build a cleaver every run, basically. And you can watch my guides for how to make a cleaver. And these weapons are just really high in damage. The basic attacks, they make bleeds, which do high damage against raw HP. They are the only two-handed weapon that attacks twice per turn. And they can also decapitate, which does bonus damage based on the missing hit points of an opponent. And also it decapitates, so it's good against undeads and stuff. Really high single target damage. And really like them. Very strong for late game. Next one, Guten Tag. The Guten Tag is an early game weapon. It's a combination between a mace and a spear. And it's kind of funny, depending on what kind of... It has a stun and a stab ability. If you use the stab ability, you get bonus hit chance. If you use the stun ability, you use it like a mace and you stun. So it's kind of nice early game if you find it. It's a two-handed weapon. That's like one of the two-handed weapons that I find really interesting for the early game, right? You can stab somebody or you can just stun somebody. A good utility, decent damage. Good on early game bros and builds, I would say. Okay, the two-handed sword is a good weapon for the mid-game builds. This weapon has additional percent to hit the head and additional hit chance. And this is the major benefit. The two-handed sword has very high base damage, 80 to 100, same like the axe, but very low armor pen and armor effectiveness. And that's the downside. It cannot compete late game against the axe, because the axe does the same damage, but it actually does more single target damage because of the higher armor pen and armor effectiveness. But the axe doesn't have additional hit chance. So this is for bros that have very low hit chance. For a hedge knight that low rolled melee attack, or in general for bros who have good stats, like good melee defense and good other primary stats, but they are lacking hit chance. For these bros, you want to have something like a pike or a billhook with additional 5% hit chance. This one with sword mastery has additional 5% hit chance. And this one also has the swing and the split. So it has reliable AoE in your front line, which is really good with reach advantage decks. So you can make a very defensive bro out of a bro that has low melee attack. It's really good damage against opponents that don't have armor or don't have only little armor, something like brigands or the southern guys, orcs, low armor opponents. Good against bees because of the AoE, low armor opponents as well. So it's good for mid-game, faults of late game, because the other two-handed weapons just generally do more damage, especially against armor. But this is good for early game bros that don't have high, or mid-game bros that don't have high melee attack. Works really well for them. This is the tier 1 version, I would say, is good damage early game, if you can find it. Higher brigands drop these ones. These ones get dropped. The big two-handers, they get dropped by brigand leaders, technically. And I think mercenaries can have them too. So if you find this weapon early on, can boost your run. It's high damage early on. Okay, this is an additional spear. Again, good for early game bros because of the hit chance. And then I should continue with the second tier maces. And the second tier maces are good for mid games, I say. Because you can make stun bots, basically. And these guys are actually decent mid game. What you basically do is you take a bro you can take basically any bro, even bro with low melee skill, give them fast adaptation and mace mastery, and make them into stun bots. And these guys, you can give them shield mastery too, give them a shield. These guys can just walk up to an enemy, a dangerous enemy like an orc warrior, an orc berserker, You can't stun Orc Berserkers, I'm sorry. But you can walk up to a scary enemy, something like an, how are they called? A fallen hero or something, and you can stun them. Or a brigand leader, stuff that is scary on. Even brigands are scary on. You can just stun. Very useful utility. And even decent damage, I say. It's also, these have fairly high armor damage and armor ignore, so they are decent against armors as well. So, this is also, okay, and then the tier 3 mace. This is also, I think this is actually the Southern Mace. Yeah, I think the Southern Mace is either the same or a little bit worse than the tier 3 Winged Mace. The Winged Mace is actually for the Mace dualist, and the Mace dualist is a very strong late game build. It has the same benefits of the cleaver, but you have lower damage, lower base damage, but with way more armor ignore and way more armor effectiveness. So what happens is, especially if you find a famed version, you want to build a Mace dualist. With dualist, these weapons go to 70% armor ignore. So almost all of your damage goes directly to hit points and ignores armor. These weapons are insane against medium, low HP armors. Something like Ancient Undead, Noble Houses, Mercenaries. These weapons destroy these kind of opponents. And they are even decent against higher armored opponents like Chosen and Orc Warriors. Even though they are less effective there, you would rather have a two-hander. They still work, and they have the utility to stun opponents, which is also very nice. And especially with something like Executioner, Crippling Strikes, they are very good against Chosen because you injure them and you do bonus damage on your second hit. Really, guys, a really nice late game weapon. But again, you have to have a bro with high fatigue. It's very stats and perk requirements. Has very high stats and perk requirements. I recommend my guide for more details on the Mace dualist. But again, very strong late game weapon. The Mace dualist, I like it. So in that case, I think we can do the one-handed cleavers. There is a cleaver. This is the Kopesh, the Necrosavant cleaver. This is the military cleaver, and I don't like these weapons at all. The one-handed cleaver dualist is very similar to the two-handed cleaver, but the two-handed cleaver just generally does more damage. These attack twice per turn, these attack twice per turn. These ones do more damage. They cost a little bit more fatigue to use, but these weapons require duelist in order to do more damage. These weapons don't. So I say you can still build them, but it's most of the time would probably a waste of a build, waste of a perk. It is probably just better to go for a two-handed cleaver instead and just skip the cleaver duelist. I do not recommend the cleaver duelist, but you can try that. All right, this is the fire lance. This is also a spear from the Southern guys, Spetum, early polearm. Then we have the Warhammer. Is it a special build or is it a build I don't like? Okay, I generally don't like the one-handed hammer weapons because they offer armor damage at a point where basically nothing has armor, and the base damage is really low. This is kind of the downside of all hammers. They have very low base damage with really high armor effectiveness, which makes them good against armored opponents, but trash against unarmored opponents or lower armored opponents. So, and generally having higher base damage makes more armor damage happen, right? So, and the problem is the base damage of these one-handed hammers is so low. It is in my opinion really hard to make a use case for this. They proc fearsome though, because they do guaranteed hit 10 HP damage if they hit. So there's the shield hammer build. I would say it's a very special build that I don't like. And I mean, you can try it out. I really don't like it, but it works well with fearsome. So if you have a bro that has really low stats, but high fatigue, but low melee defense, something like this, you can give him a shield and a one-handed hammer, and he will reliably proc fearsome checks. So a very special build that I don't like, but it can work. The hammer dualist is also something you can try. Yeah, at your own risk, I would say. Okay, this one is the Southern Club. It's kind of like the bludgeon, more or less the same weapon. Yeah, then we have the Shamshirs. These are, I would say, because they are swords, good for the early and mid game. Kind of the southern variant of the arming swords and the normal swords. They have, I think, less armor effectiveness, if I'm not mistaken, but they have the special ability Gush, which can be nice if you try to set up for executioner hits, because they have a lower chance to sustain injury, so you will injure your opponent a lot of the time way more, and you can get then the bonus damage for your from executioner if you hit them. Kind of a meme build, but hey, plus 10% hit chance early game, always good. Okay, the Saif is the weaker version of the two-handed cleaver. I would say it's good mid game. If you can't find one of the top cleavers, you can just run around with this weapon. It is still very high base damage with decapitate. So this is for the two-handed cleaver who didn't found one of the tier 3 cleavers, right? So that's where I would put that. Okay, then let's go with the Warbrand. The Warbrand is a sword that can hit 2 times per turn. Is a two-handed sword. Is really low. It's medium damage. It's not that high damage, but has additional hit chance. So good for early game. You know, it's kind of like a little bit like this sword. Just it's a weird weapon. Kind of good for early game for the additional hit chance, but late game cannot compete with other higher damage late game weapons. So let's see. Should we do flails? Yes, let's do the flails. Okay, the flails have only a tier 1 version. I would say the tier 1 version from the two-handed flail is good for early game, because again, they ignore the bonus from that are granted by shields. All flails do that. And they can also, and this is kind of the primary thing. They have, for early game, a little bit high damage, and they can ignore shield walls. So for bros that, if you fight early on like Ancient Undead or something, or you want to find Noble House units early on, ignoring shield walls can be pretty strong. So can be decent for early games stuff if you find them early. Brigands have them. Yeah, but I wouldn't buy them. It's not a good, strong late game weapon, because the tier 3 or the tier 2 two-handed flail is a very strong late game weapon. It is a special build. It requires, because the flail has additional chance to hit head, and with mastery you do more damage on headshots. So what you do is you basically, if you find a brute guy, brute is a trait, which makes you do 15% more damage on headshots. So if you find somebody who is brute, this guy, you want to make into a flail guy with a two-handed flail. And then you take Headhunter. What that means, you can see that in my Headhunter run, a brute guy with a two-handed flail and Headhunter has a 40% chance to two-shot an Orc Warrior. The damage from this is just insane because of the brute trait. So if you find somebody who has high melee attack and the brute trait, you want to make him into a two-handed flail guy. Actually, this is a special build. It is a special weapon for a special bro, I would say. So I would put this in special build, which can be very, very strong casually, if you find the right bro to use it. If not, it's still okay damage with Headhunter, but you really want to find the brute in order to utilize the full damage. All right. Then let's do most of the time. This is only the two-handed weapons, the pole maces and pole weapons and stuff. So, the sword lance and the war size are both pole arms that have basically the swing attack from the sword. So you hit 3 opponents, 1 tile away actually. This is an AoE build that is nice for mid-game builds, especially if you're somebody with a polearm mastery. These weapons are actually pretty nice. The downside is they have very low base damage and armor effectiveness, so against high armored opponents can't really use these weapons, but they are very nice against unarmored and medium armored opponents. Very good against beasts, brigands, and stuff like this. So early to mid game, very high damage, like most polearms. And they have additional headshot chance, I think, as well. So good for early mid game, not really good for late game, but most of the time having one polearm or one polearm crossbow guy for late game is not a bad. Okay, then we have the Warhammer, the two-handed Warhammer. Yeah, I would say same with the pole mace. These weapons are kind of the polearm weapons that you kind of want to use on your backline bros that you want to level up safely. And if you find them early on, they can have high damage early on. This can stun. They have lesser damage than the normal two-handed weapons that have 1 tile reach. These have 2 tile reach. But again, especially for mid game, where you have a lot of bros that don't have high melee defense and can't really take contact with enemy opponents, these weapons, all the reach weapons basically are pretty solid for backliners. Making a dedicated guy for these is most of the time not worth it. But quick hands, they are decent on quick hands users. So if you have a hammer guy who can quick hand to the warhammer to hit somebody on 2 tiles away, or the pole mace to hit somebody on 2 tiles away, that's kind of the point where you still sometimes use them late game. But this is kind of like mid game decent damage against armored opponents. Yeah, then what's left are the hammers and the maces. I will just take the barbarian hammers and maces and put them in this category because they have low damage. The barbarian orcs and the barbarian weapons have lower damage than the normal variants. And I will put the mace and the tier 1 two-handed hammer. I will put them in good for early game, I would say. They offer the stagger and the daze, and they offer high damage, high single target damage. So if you have a bro that has fairly high melee defense, is pretty survivable, you can give them these two-handed weapons. Same with the two-handed flail, and they will do high damage. You also need a bro who has decent melee attack. So these weapons are more for higher damage bros. Actually, yeah, these are more for higher end bros that, yeah, or for trash bros you want to throw away, and you just don't care about their lives. But yeah, equipping these early on is really good damage early on, and offers you utility early on. All 3 of these basic two-handed weapons. Then we have the hammer and the mace. Both of these weapons are very strong late game. They are the tier 3 variant of the two-handed mace and two-handed hammer. The two-handed hammer has the swing attack from the sword, but it can only go counterclockwise, which makes them very good for left flank bros. They have insane armor effectiveness, which makes them incredibly good against orc warriors, orc warlords, and chosen, and armored unholds, because these bros, they will shred with 1 hit basically the whole opponent's armor. Insane damage. They've fairly low base damage, but the armor effectiveness is high, the armor penetration is very high, and they offer the stagger hit, which lowers the initiative of an opponent, which is pretty good if you fight against strong single target stuff like unholds or something like that. So you can basically, if your hammer hits the opponent, this opponent will act probably last. If this is a heavily armored opponent with already low initiative, you have a decent chance of killing that opponent that turn before he acts. So this basically changes the turn order, which is very strong. The two-handed mace goes very well with the mace Katal build, with the Katal in conjunction. This weapon is probably same with the Great Axe and the cleaver, probably the highest damage two-hander in the game. It can stun like all the other maces. It offers the daze effect. And the daze effect basically makes the opponent, it lowers their stats and makes them do less damage to you. So this is really good. But at the same time, it has also very high base damage. I think the second highest base damage is 75 to 90. And this is 80 to 100, same as the big sword. A little bit lower damage than the axes, but 50% armor pen. So the mace actually does more damage directly to HP. So it tends to do very well against armored opponents, and it tends to has lower hits per kill on some opponents. It kills faster basically, and also it saves your own bros because the opponents that get hit by this weapon, they don't do as much damage back to you. Yeah, is my weapon tier list. I see there are no ranged weapons here. We can briefly go over the ranged weapons if you want. The ranged weapons. So we have on the ranged weapons, we have the bows. Obviously, the strongest bow is the master crafted bow or the war bow. Bows are a very special build. You need somebody who has very high range skill for this, and you want to have a famed bow so you can basically snipe opponents behind cover. That's kind of the design of the war bow. You want to snipe single opponents or do very high damage against unarmored opponents. I have videos about how to make a bow guy, very specific build. Crossbows are really good damage early on because they have additional hit chance. Good on bros who have lower range skill, and also very high armor penetration, especially with mastery. And these bows are very good against Chosen, especially the spiked impaler, because you knock back an opponent and you have the very high chance of injuring heavy armored opponents. That's where you take crossbows. Really good early game damage. Decent. The crossbow polearm build is a very good mid game build, and still works late game against Chosen especially. Then we have the cannon, the gun, who does. I'm not a big fan of the gun, but you can build a gun bro. The gun bro does basically does giant AoE, hits up to 6 targets, and is very strong in combination with debuffing stuff like fearsome. But it's very low damage and armor effectiveness. So these guns, at least this is my opinion, they tend to not kill stuff, but they strip away a lot of armor and they can proc stuff like fearsome. So it's a very special build, but you can build around them. Especially the double gunner build where you have a gun in your backpack, you reload and then shoot twice. So very special, good with fearsome. But yeah, then we have the throwing weapons. The barbarian throwing weapons are the throwing weapons, the bundle of heavy javelins and heavy throwing axes that you want to work with. These weapons, in combination with throwing mastery, have very high base damage and a high % chance to hit, but they have low range. These are one of your highest DPS early game and mid game. Even with dualist, they can't do high damage late game. And you can make a hybrid that is then also a melee dualist with a sword or something, or a spear. Good damage early game, mid game. Tends to fall off later a little bit. Got nerfed multiple times. But still very good early and mid game. Brigands have them commonly. Also the barbarians, they have throwing weapons. So we will find them there. Then of course you have the other throwing stuff that is kind of just utility, really good. Nets are always really good to root the target and lower his initiative and stuff. This is kind of all the weapons, the normal weapons. Again, famed weapons are always better than the normal versions, and it can be, if you find a nice famed weapon, even if it's from the lower tier or the special tier, if you find a famed hammer that rolled high on damage, it is probably a good idea to make a hammer dualist or something. But yeah, this is kind of like my assessment on how I use my weapons that I find in the game, what kind of builds I make. I have on all of these builds, especially the top tier weapons, I have guides. I have guides about Axe Bros, Dagger Bros, Cleaver Bros, Hammer Bros, Mace Cartal, Mace Bros, all that stuff. Yeah. Early game, you want to utilize the bonus hit chance from swords and spears and the utility of the maces for the stun and the pole weapons for damage. The flails to go for the head and loot armor. Same with the knives. You want to stab, puncture, and ignore armor, so you can loot the armor after that. And you know, all of these weapons you will use if you have no other option, or if you are, you know, if you're a little bit silly and you want to have a little bit fun with the two-handed orc flail and, you know, you want to one-shot stuff, or with the two-handed man splitter. If you're a madman, you're going to use them. And you will also use the loot just for fun and for the achievement, guys. All right, this is it for today. Write me down in the comments if you have different opinions on that. And yeah, this is just a brief talk. You can kind of just probably throw stuff around. And the weapons in the tier list, in the tiers themselves, are in no particular order. I think all of them are pretty strong. So yeah, this could be number one, could be the last one. It's in no particular order, guys. And yeah, all right. Thank you. Thank you for watching, guys. I rambled a little bit. I was a little bit all over the place. I hope you got still through this and got some value out of this. And yeah, have a nice day, guys. I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.